Hello, I'm Scott Turner, and I'm Director of Science Programs at the National Association of Scholars. How are we doing at teaching science to our children? It's vital to our country and to our society that we do it well. We're teaching the future scientists of America, and we're also laying the foundation for a citizenry that will have to grapple with issues that are tied up with science. There's increasing evidence, however, that we're not doing as well as we think we should be. At the National Association of Scholars, we've been engaged in a project to do science teaching better. It's the Franklin Standards, Model K through 12 State Science Standards is the fruits of our efforts. With us today are two principals behind the Franklin Standards. Randy Wayne is Associate Professor of Plant Science at Cornell University, and he's Project Director for the Franklin Standards Project. And David Randall is Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars. He's the Project Coordinator for the Franklin Standards Project. Welcome to the both of you. Glad you're here. Okay, so let's kick off our conversation with the name Franklin Standards. Randy, why that name, and what does the name say about what the Franklin Standards will bring to science education?
Well, the Franklin Standards is named after Benjamin Franklin, one of the founders of our country, and a scientist and an inventor. And most importantly for the Franklin Standards, he was curious. And the curiosity stimulated him to ask questions that allowed him to be such a good scientist and inventor. So one day when he was leaving to go to England, he noticed that two of the ships in a 96-ship fleet had wakes that were very calm, where the other ones had ripples caused by the waves. And he asked the captain of the ship he was on, why are the wakes of those ships smooth while the other ones are rippled? And the captain, thinking that everybody would know why, said the cooks just probably threw the greasy cooking oil out of the ships, and that calmed the waves. And Franklin, being a curious person, thought, I want to test that. And he kind of remembered that Pliny had written long ago about that ships would put out oil to calm the waves, and that fishermen knew that they could calm the waves by putting some oil in the water. And he decided, I'm going to just test this. And he took a teaspoonful of oil and he put it on the water. And as it moved out, he could see the colors of the oil. And then he could no longer see the colors, but he could see that the water had been stilled. And a teaspoon of oil stilled about a half an acre of water. And he realized that this told him something about the structure of water and the structure of oil, and how the water and the oil interacted with each other, that they repelled each other. And in fact, the oil molecules repelled each other, and that's why they went out so quickly. He noticed that dead flies would actually spin around from the oil moving out so quickly. And so from this, he got to know the molecular structure of water, oil, the interactions, that the wind itself would ruffle the water because there was enough friction, but the oil on the water acted as oil does in a machine and stopped the friction and smoothed the water because the wind couldn't ruffle it up.
The remarkable thing about that whole story is the way that just simple curiosity led to some pretty profound insights into the molecular structure of not only water, but also of oil and how it associates. And this was even before people barely knew that there were such things as molecules, right. And so, do we still have that essential element of curiosity in our science education, do you think?
I think kids come to school with that curiosity, that it's inbred, it's part of human nature, and then science education kicks it out.
How does it do that?
If you give kids enough information that they can build their wonder. Of course, you don't want to overwhelm them, but you want to give them enough information, enough content that they can put words to what they see and build their thinking. It makes that wonder even better. If you concentrate on just memorizing the words, don't associate it with anything that has to do with wonder and curiosity, but just something that's testable, they soon learn that they really don't like science.
So they come out of high school really not being, or actually having curiosity sort of beaten out of them?
I would say that.
I would say that.
I would say that.
So David, this is where the K through 12 science education standards come in. Throughout K through 12, we've always taught what we call science, but what's wrong with what we're doing now about that? And tell us a bit about how the Franklin Standards actually improves on that.
So what matters in modern public K-12 education above all are state science standards. Each state for the last generation or so gives an outline of expectations for what should be taught in each subject matter. Unfortunately, since about 2012 or so, a model called the Next Generation Science Standards has become terribly influential. It replaced some really good models in California, in Massachusetts, in New York, and brought in a model that is mediocre in the amount of content knowledge it provides, that uses this strange pedagogy called inquiry-based learning, which converts everything into asking questions, which is just confusing for students to learn at early ages, certainly, and is frankly difficult for teachers to understand when they're reading a bureaucratic document phrased entirely as questions with only hints of answers. And then there's unfortunately a heavy slab of politicization. This is the diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology for everything. A lack of rigor coming with it on the grounds of equity, therefore no math, no formulas, no expectations on the grounds of a false egalitarianism. And then there are a number of subjects which are unfortunately presented in very political and narrow ways. The hot button issues of climate change and evolution are done in ways that are narrow, misleading, and inimical to good science education. And this is the model for 48, 49 states are at the very least influenced by the NGSS, and some of them are close to copy and paste.
So you think inquiry-based learning would be very conducive to the kind of curiosity-driven research that Randy just described. So how does that stamp out curiosity in science and science students?
It's misdone. That's the most important thing. Especially early on, you need a foundation of knowledge to build your curiosity from. You've got to know that an object has length, dimension, solidity before you can start asking further questions about it. You've got to know that leaves fall in the autumn before you can start asking questions about ecology. You've got to know that when you turn water into ice, it gets bigger before you can start doing a good experiment with water. So you need to have that basic foundation of knowledge to build the curiosity. And then when you have curiosity, you need to be allowed to be open to know that science is a matter of debate, of conversation, of unsettled science, and not to be told, oh, here's the answer, you must believe this. That will kill curiosity worse than anything. Yeah. So they teach too much when they shouldn't, and they teach too little when they should in inquiry-based learning.
So Randy just described this fantastic experiment that Benjamin Franklin did, and it started off with an initial question, an inquiry-based question. Why is it that the wakes of certain ships are smooth and the wakes of others aren't? Randy, what was it that prepared Benjamin Franklin to carry on from that inquiry-based question to a deep understanding of the structure of matter?
One thing he did was he always carried a little bit of oil in the top of his bamboo cane. So at any chance he had, he could repeat the experiment and show the experiment to other people and communicate with them about the meaning of the experiment. And so he replicated and communicated, and he also emphasized reading the ancients and knowing what the common person was doing, the fisherman, what they know, and integrate all that information so he could come to the greatest conclusions. He didn't know what molecules were. There was no sense of molecules at the time, so he couldn't have calculated from the volume of the teaspoonful and the area over the half acre of the lake where the oil went, what the height of the molecules would have been. But somebody did, Agnes Potness and Lord Rayleigh, and it turns out it's about a nanometer. And I have my students make that calculation to understand dimensional analysis. And it led to the Lamure trough later, where you put some molecules on some water and you corral them and see how much force they exert against the bar, and to understand how, for example, all plasma membranes are formed in the lipid bilayers that make them up.
So in the modern next generation science standards and inquiry-based learning, what's wrong with that approach? What's missing in that would enable students to make the same kinds of insights and lay the same kinds of foundations that, say, Benjamin Franklin did?
That they simply wouldn't have the basis of knowledge is, I guess, what it comes down to again. That they would need to be told all the basics of how the experiment works. They would need to learn what is the previous level of scientific knowledge which this is working with, and then they should be encouraged to perform that experiment. I would also say, by the way, part of what Franklin did, after all, was write up his experiments. The next generation science standards are also not good at concrete expectations for scientific writing. That you have a laboratory report built up, that you have a scientific research paper, that it has, the formal expectations in terms of how it's structured, question, hypothesis, solutions check, in the research paper, literature check, but it doesn't have even basic things like, and it should be 5 pages long, in high school. It should be 1 or 2 pages long in 7th grade. And without that basic requirement of, you not only need to do the experiment, but you need to think it through by writing it out, and be able to have your fellow students be able to read it and ask questions, that's just going to get lost from the actual classroom. Because if you don't have that expectation spelled out explicitly, unfortunately, far too many teachers are simply going to pass it by.
Yeah, especially if you look at things like science fairs and the way science is actually taught in classrooms, there's almost a performative aspect to it. You do this, and then you're doing science. And has that been your experience with the next generation science standards? Is that coming from that?
My sense of the next generation science standards is that it encourages pointless questions that waste students' time, and then rote learning at too shallow a level to be useful. And above all, I guess I would say lack of the essential mathematical rigor that you need to really dig into science and, to be ready for college. But, to learn the truths of science that can only be expressed in the language of mathematics. As you progress in science, there are some truths where any paraphrase in the English language is a distortion. And the NGSS, by simply getting rid of any expectation for learning the mathematical knowledge of science, means that students are never prepared, not just for a career, not just for collegiate science, but for the wonder, the curiosity that comes from learning the truths of science in the language of mathematics.
Scott, do you think the Franklin Standards has the ability to bring real science back to the classroom?
I think so. One of my criticisms of the K through 12 science education that I've seen, I already mentioned, it has a kind of performative aspect to it, and this is especially evident in situations like science fairs, where there's a very formulaic approach to participating in a science fair, and that's one particular way of doing science. And one of the pernicious things that does is it tells students that there's a formula for science, that you have a set recipe and you turn the crank and somehow you're doing science. And that's not what makes science go. As you mentioned, it's curiosity that makes science go. And not only that, but informed curiosity. Benjamin Franklin had this hypothesis, if you will. Well, what happens if I spread oil in the water? Why is it going to smooth the wakes behind the ships? And he went from that and inferred some rather interesting things about the structure of lipids. And when I've judged science fairs, for example, the students are coached to, give a particular presentation, to have their hypothesis, to have their experimental test all laid out. And when you follow up with questions, it's clear that the students have not been trained in just asking questions about tapping into their natural curiosity about matter and nature and the universe. And the tragedy there, of course, as you have already said, young kids are naturally curious. They want to find out about the world. And that's sort of crushed out of them, I think. And the thing about the Franklin Standards that I think is really positive is that it not only focuses on preparing minds for informed curiosity, and so this is where the rigor of the mathematics, understanding the properties, where the properties come from, up to basic questions, very broad questions like what is evolution? Just what is it and how does it work? To be able to ask informed questions like that, you have to have a grounding in facts. And at the same time, you don't want to ground your education so heavily in facts that it becomes rote learnings. I mean, we're not running madrasas here. We're running schools to produce informed citizens. And if we're not doing something that enhances curiosity, but also enables students to explore that curiosity in a disciplined, informed way, then we're not teaching science to students.
One of the things that you brought up during our discussions in creating the Franklin Standards is using the term scientific methodologies. And as time goes on, I truly appreciate that more and more. David and I had a little wait a minute, let's talk about the scientific method. But you talked about that the scientific method has certain flexibility. That's good. Would you explain that a little more?
Yeah, one of the things that has bothered me about not only science, but also science education, and this is part of the formulaic aspect of science education, the scientific method. And what they are referring to as a scientific method is a very restricted, actually not a very restricted, but a restricted set of approaches to scientific questions that doesn't encompass the entire range of what science is. And so, for example, if you're doing a chemistry experiment and you're trying to answer a question about the nature of a molecule, then it makes sense. The scientific method makes sense in that you have a question, you formulate a testable hypothesis in an experiment that's intended to test that hypothesis, and you either try to falsify the hypothesis or if it doesn't, then you go back to the drawing board and you think about another experiment with hypothesis test analysis and so forth. And that's a perfectly valid and appropriate way to approach certain scientific questions. But where it starts to fail is in fundamental questions where you cannot do an experiment. You know, if you look at what Georges Cuvier in France did, looking at the strata of sedimentary rocks, for example, and the different sets of fossils that you would find in that, there's no way you can do an experiment with that. It's an observation. And you take these observations and you build on those observations. You look at different kinds of things. You gather information. And from that, you formulate an inference about the way history has played out. And the scientific method is totally inappropriate for that kind of thing. And so what I think we need to emphasize is not just this formulaic turn-the-crank model that you see so frequently in science fairs and frankly in science education, to a broader concept of scientific methodology. And that's bringing in a set of attitudes, if you will, to scientific questions. You have to bring in not only previous knowledge, you need to bring in skepticism and curiosity, and you need to know enough for how to organize that skepticism and curiosity into formulating basic ideas about the way history has played out. And you run into this all the time in behavior, in evolutionary biology, in geology, in earth science, and those kinds of things. And if we focus on scientific methodology rather than the scientific method, I think we'll have a much richer science education in the K through 12 schools.
So I think the Franklin standards are unique in bringing out abductive reasoning. And would you describe abductive reasoning and how it can be useful?
I'm not sure I can, because there's deductive reasoning, there's inductive reasoning, and there's abductive reasoning. And I have to say, abductive was a new term to me, but I think abductive reasoning is this very concept of gathering information and formulating it into a logical, consistent point of view, basically. And that's what I understand abductive reason.
Right.
I could have it wrong.
You're right, but especially for historical data like Cuvier, where you can't do an experiment you can't recreate the Earth. And so you gather all the different information and make the best inference.
I would also add to all this, there is also a distinction. This is a slight contrast in point of view, that to say that scientific methodologies, although plural, are still distinctive from this idea of other ways of scientific knowing, which is, excuse me, trying to say that every different culture on Earth, in what they're in their observations in the natural world, that this is all somehow equivalent to science, and yet this just is not so. That the scientific methodologies are based upon some core principles of scientific epistemology, and developed from Aristotle onward. There is a truth to be known in the natural world, that the human mind is capable of exercising reason upon it, and that we can combine the ability to come up with theory with the checks against experiment in rigorous and an orderly manner. This is, I think, distinguishing all of the scientific methodologies of the Western tradition from all the other quote-unquote ways of knowing, unquote.
So what is it that makes this scientific way of knowing different from, say, the Iroquois way of knowing, or whatever other alternative way of looking at the world there is? What is it that makes the scientific way of knowing distinctive?
There is, a number of things. It is very important that you say that there are things accessible to human knowledge and reason, and that we found our work on that. We also think that this is explicitly a body of knowledge to think about, to analyze, to extend. And this gets us not just, first you have science, all knowledge, then natural science, the knowledge of the natural world, then disciplinary knowledge, biology, chemistry, physics. Each of these is a way of saying this is a body of knowledge we think about and we work on, knowing what we're working on. To recur, above all, to experiment and not just theory, that you need to have the theory to make broad analytical patterns, and you need to have the experiment to say, well, maybe it just ain't so. And I guess I would say then for the culture, that scientists talk with one another about science, that they write about science, that they offer their arguments to one another for the judgment of their fellow scientists. And this is not, it's not consensus, which is just authority, unexamined authority, again, by another name, but it's this mutuality to accept criticism and to frame your search for knowledge with a scientific character of humility, that other people should judge this, and wanting other people to take what you can, add their own search for truth, and correct you where you're wrong. Yes. All that is part of this Western tradition of scientific inquiry.
And I think the Franklin Standards does a great job of separating what's a fact, what's a theory, what's evidence, what's the analysis of evidence, and how do you analyze it to make an inference that gives you a conclusion, and again, how other people can question you on that to make sure together we get to the truth without accepting the authority of either the monarch or the mob.
But at the heart of this, of course, is the willingness to be wrong, and I think that's what you meant by bringing humility to the question. That we're not all about facts; we're about querying nature to try to get nature to tell us about itself, and that we may be wrong about it.
And in the introduction of the Franklin Standards, it stresses intellectual hospitality, the mixture of humility and civility. And that's something that is not taught in the NGSS, because you're taught this is what's true. There's no legitimate controversy when it comes to two topics in particular: evolution and climate change. The Franklin Standards presents great scientific evidence that there is controversy.
This is not precisely science, but I'll just introduce it. One of the most important things in statistics, which is terrifically important for a wide variety of sciences now, is not to think of statistics as giving us areas of certain knowledge. It's a way of measuring our doubt and our uncertainty. Yes. And the strength of science, the strength of statistics, the strength of mathematics depends upon its humility. And the more we say about what we don't know for sure, the better able we are to say what we do know with confidence. And you need both halves of that.
You know, if I ask my students, if I were your professor and I told you this shirt were red and I gave you a test, there's one question on the test, what color is my shirt? What are you going to write? 95% of the students will say red, because they have no interest in what the truth is. They have the interest in what the test point is, which is, again, the authority of the monarch. Mm-hmm. And the idea that you just brought up about statistics tells us about our uncertainty. And uncertainty isn't a bad thing in science. It's what allows us to go make more experiments, more observations, more tests, and to get closer to the truth. That we should welcome that uncertainty and try to remedy it in some respects.
So you mentioned this concept of intellectual hospitality, and I was just at a conference where I threw that term around a lot, and it was a mystery to a lot of people there. These are professional people. Tell us a bit more about what intellectual hospitality is, and maybe how this notion of humility feeds into it.
We actually introduced the term intellectual hospitality in the introduction of the Franklin Standards. It was a phrase coined by John Dewey to encompass both humility and civility. That humility that you may not be right, and civility that when you take other people's criticisms of you, you take it respectfully, and they give it respectfully, and together you try to reach the truth. The Heterodox Academy has a five ways of the Heterodox Academy, where two of them represent intellectual hospitality. It's known as intellectual charity and intellectual humility. And it's a real great way of engaging people. It's a way to not make enemies and not fight right away, but to try to strive for the truth together, not trying to win a battle, but to together search for the truth. And I think the Franklin Standards actually give a model and help develop from K through 12 how to approach science this way with humility and civility.
So how do the next generation science standards fail to cultivate that virtue?
Largely by simply saying, this is the truth and you will know about it, about a number of areas of controverted science. And again, evolution and climate science are strong above them. And then tying it explicitly to this activism model, that the point of doing science is to, bully rag your local town into spending more on environmental cleanup, whether or not it's needed. I'm being a little sour about this, but the idea that you should train students to be environmental activists before they even know how the environment works, much less what the counter arguments are. And I must say, this is, down to the, I can tell you that, in the higher levels, you have, the government will sometimes force a factory to clean up, stuff that's going into a local river because there are pollutants coming down from the river, except, oops, if you look at the data, they actually got the sample from a different river rather than the one that's supposedly being polluted. And when you go into the weeds like this, it makes you think you ought to at least look into the data before you start being trained to be an activist. And in fact, and then of course, it's simply inappropriate for a scientist to be an activist first, to seek power, change in the world, rather than truth, to be uncommitted to a particular outcome is psychologically and intellectually necessary to preserve the capacity for wonder, for curiosity that you've been talking about. You can't be curious if you think you already know the answer and what you need to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic example of the road to hell being paved with good intentions. We put a lot of money into education. We put a lot of money into science, and the expectation that's drilled into us from start to finish is that we have to somehow give back to society, that we have to somehow serve public interest in everything that we do. But when we come to something like Benjamin Franklin, for example, what public service was he serving by spreading oil on the water and thinking about molecules? I would argue none, really.
I think actually the best public service that he gave to the country was knowing about science and knowing Newton's laws and knowing about checks and balances with forces to help set up a government.
Benjamin Franklin actually has this wonderful experiment about how people were hidebound by their theories. There was this theory in Europe that going to the New World made you shorter, that you somehow decayed because, something about the air, the atmosphere, the climate was just sort of making you lesser and lesser. And so he simply, he was in Paris, during the American Revolution, our ambassador, he simply lined up a bunch of Americans, fellow emissaries, next to a bunch of fellow Frenchmen. And it's like, the Americans on average are a little taller than the average Frenchman. Perhaps something is wrong with your theory. And this common sense resort to experiment, to fact, to see what your eyes can see, rather than to be bound by a theory. That's what science should have.
That's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
Randy, what's the structure of the Franklin Standards? What's in them?
Oh, the Franklin Standards have 3 content areas: biology, life science being one, physical science, including physics and chemistry, and the third one, earth and space science. It also includes engineering and technology. It includes history of science. It includes scientific inquiry.
And what's scientific inquiry?
This is what made me fall in love with the Franklin Standards. It talks about the character and habit of scientists. It talks about what makes a good scientist, the importance of seeking the truth, the importance of integrity, the importance of humility, the importance of civility, the understanding of what is a fact, what is evidence, what is a hypothesis, what is a theory, and understanding of the scientific methodologies, what makes something science as opposed to a way of knowing. It also talks about what's the limits of science, that science doesn't necessarily determine moral reasoning, aesthetic reasoning, and other things like that.
Now, you mentioned the history of science, and I gather there's a heavy emphasis on the Franklin Standards on the history of scientific thought and the remarkable scientists who have shaped scientific discovery. Now, why is the history of science important for science education?
The history of science is fundamental to science education. Knowing the history of science lets us know how we know what we know. So you can look at the evidence, you can look at the experiments, you can look at the analysis and reasoning and see both the value and the limitations of those things that went into the conclusions that maybe somebody is being tested on. And you could say, oh, as a scientist, I question some of those. I want to develop myself as a scientist, inspired by these people, to make different experiments and perhaps come up with different conclusions.
Thank you. Now I have some questions for Scott. I'm actually going to ask more generally about the biology life sciences first. What does a student learn about biology life sciences from K to 12? And how is it structured so that what you learn in kindergarten and grade 1 leads up to middle school and then to high school?
Well, in the typical next generation science standards framework, it covers quite a wide range of topics, but in my opinion, not in a way that builds the case for biology as a coherent science itself. And so, for example, evolution might be introduced in high school, for example. And when evolution is introduced, it's a very narrowly defined definition of what evolution is. It doesn't distinguish between evolution as a process and evolution as a mechanism, so whatever it is that drives it. It doesn't do a very good job, in my opinion, of integrating all the things that went into the development of evolutionary thought. And especially since we're talking about the history of science, the history of evolutionary thought is incredibly rich and incredibly nuanced. And I don't think students come away with a good feeling for just how incredibly nuanced it is, because it's a very complicated history, and it's a history that doesn't lead to a certainty of evolution and how it works. And part of science is, of course, this intellectual humility of being uncertain about what it is that you do. I think it's also a little bit. It emphasizes a little bit too much just looking at organisms as collections of things. There's digestive system, there's the nervous system, those kinds of things. And again, we come back to this notion of the history of our thinking about the way the body works. Is incredibly rich and incredibly nuanced, and there's wisdom to be gleaned from old ways of looking at life, for example, that the next generation science standards don't really emphasize very well. And I think the Franklin Standards steps in and offers that. So it offers, I think, a more nuanced and actually rich way of looking at the life sciences.
And I'll just add, one of the things I thought did this really nicely in terms of how you build and progress, that in grade 3, I believe it is, you have the history of life on Earth. It doesn't tell you about evolution yet. That's the theory. It tells you the facts we know about life on Earth, the evidence we have, and then really important foundational knowledge like here is the Cenozoic, here is the Mesozoic, here is the Jurassic and the Triassic and the Cretaceous, and that this is the basic knowledge you need in 3rd grade, which you need to make sense of evolution later on.
Yeah. Every 3rd grader knows what the Jurassic period is, but very few students actually know what the Jurassic period is. They know it from Jurassic Park and it has something to do with dinosaurs, for example, but putting it in the context of the broad spectacle of life is somewhat lacking presently, I think.
And Randy, you're also a biologist. Is there anything you also wanted to say about biology and how it's taught in the Franklin Standards?
The Franklin Standard actually, I want to discuss the richness. The next generation standards focuses primarily on ecology and evolution. And there's so many other aspects of biology, for example, the human body and genetics, that the Franklin Standards does service to, and teaching students about that.
And I'll just mention, one of the figures that I think is worth mentioning in biology, as I remember, it includes Florence Nightingale, not just for, she's a heroic nurse, which really matters, but because she was also pioneering the scientific practice of nursing. And after all, what is one of the things that biology prepares you for? Careers in the medical professions, including nursing. I think it's wonderful that the Franklin Standards has Florence Nightingale, the history of health science, as part of biology, and that it's not just learning about here is how a cell works, here is how a gene works, but here is how we have learned how to take care of human beings and make them better. And that this is wonderful that this is also part of the biology that the students are learning.
And if I remember right, she introduced statistics into her work. Yeah, we also have Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a Hungarian physician that noticed that the women giving birth in the lying-in hospitals were dying more than the women that were giving birth at home. And he realized that the doctors, when they came to work, they went down to the basement, performed autopsies, and then came back up and delivered babies without washing their hands, because doctors have clean hands, according to doctors. And but of course, when they delivered the babies, they transferred the germs of the dead bodies to the mothers, who then died of childbed fever. And we have lots of stories that mix medicine, science, practical thinking, and inspiring personalities in the Franklin Standards.
And without having a good historical knowledge, after all, and of course the history of evolutionary thought is a good example of this, it's incredibly rich, and that means that it's incredibly nuanced. There's lots of very deep thinkers about the evolutionary process, of which Darwin certainly was one. But without understanding the broader context of evolutionary thought, you really can't understand what Darwin himself did, and also how evolutionary theory has evolved since Darwin, and some of the ways in which certain things that call themselves Darwinism are not really Darwinian at all. And in teaching, say, evolutionary biology, or lots of things about biology, by ignoring this kind of incredibly nuanced history, you open the door for dogma, and this is one of the big failings in especially high school education in evolution, for example. It's very dogma driven, and maybe there are time constraints in how teachers do that, but by bringing in a very rich historical overview of what science is across the board, Darwinism, plate tectonics theory, the whole bit, you kind of open the door to non-dogmatic ways of thinking about science. And that's so essential, I think, to preparing a scientifically informed citizenry as an inoculation against dogmatism, which is depressingly prevalent today.
I think the Franklin Standards has a wonderful emphasis on teaching what are the values and what are the limitations of the evidence. And because we have a historical approach, we give a number of viewpoints that students can learn. Reasonable people can disagree on certain conclusions and interpret the evidence differently. We have one of the standards is giving students a chance to think of, where does conscience come from? And there's Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and T.H. Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce saw the evidence differently. And it's such an interesting question, and it's something that the students can look at and realize that one of their friends may disagree with them, but it's okay.
And I think the Franklin Standards is also good on having the knowledge that this is live, that we're still learning and confirming. And one thing I really loved in earth sciences, one of our colleagues added this in, the theory of plate tectonics did not precisely get experimental proof until GPS.
That was wonderful to hear.
The global positioning satellites, and now you can actually see the continents moving in real time. It was, obviously a really good theory, which accounted for an awful lot of the evidence. But just in this last generation, we now have the technology to actually say, oh yes, we witness it happening. And you can just think, there are theories that are not controversial, but it's worth knowing they're theories. The layer cake view of the Earth, that there's this inner mantle and outer mantle. We haven't actually sent people down into the center of the Earth. We have a variety of evidence, which makes this a very convincing theory. And I believe it was one of the first famous Danish women scientists in the 1930s, and I'm unfortunately blanking on her name, who looked at the data and said, "Oh yes, it's the layer cake model." For how the mantle works, the core. But students should know that that's technically a theory and how the evidence we have builds up to it. And I want to put that out there simply because that's something which is not politically controversial. It's just how science works. You have theories. They almost certainly account for the evidence, but you need to know the distinction between the facts that build the theory and the theory that makes sense of the facts.
So we've put all this effort into producing these science standards. Where do we go from here?
Where we go from here is to offer them to states, school districts, homeschooling parents, private schools, and we make our arguments. One argument is the current system isn't working terribly well. We spend something like the fifth most per capita of any OECD country. The results are 12th best on these PISA scores, which are international comparisons of scientific ability. The United States has flat scores at best, despite spending extraordinary amounts of money and increasing amounts of money. It's something like, is it $800 billion a year? We spend absolutely more on science education than any other country on earth, including China, which is no piker when it comes to spending on science. So we spend an extraordinary amount for mediocre results overall, and particularly disappointing results for high scoring in science. There's a catastrophe in terms of educating people who grew up in America to actually become science majors, graduate students, scientists. It's wonderful that America can bring in so many scientists from the rest of the world to come to America to help us with our scientific, progress, but we shouldn't have to depend on it. There should be enormous numbers of American undergraduates going into this field as well. And it's a terrible absence because that the K-12 system just is working mediocrely at best. So you say all this to the policymakers, and you say you've got to make a change in model. You don't just say what you have is bad. You say, here is our model. This is a good alternate model. It has the best stuff from the past, what was done right in California or New York or Massachusetts, and then the best of what we have learned in the latest generation. And our expert committee was really good on bringing in the latest science. So it's absolutely up to date. And then you say, bring this in, by have the state education departments do it, have the governors take the initiative, have state lawmakers take the initiative, have school boards take the initiative, and principals, and as I say, and parents. Make this be the standard, and then make it be so that science education is accountable to parents. Parents can look at the Franklin Standard and at a glance know if the teachers are doing well. State education departments can use it for the education of teachers to say, this is what you're expected to know coming in as a science teacher. Here is what your professional development should be. And they can also tell the people who make the textbooks, the publishers, here's what your textbooks should be. And they can, when they do licensure, they can say, and here's what teacher licensure should include. It's the spark for changing everything in the system, knowing that we're not going to have utopia and perfection because we're a world of human beings. But America has in the past had some of the best scientific and engineering education in the world. There's this glorious number of Nobel Prizes just at the very tip to show what we were capable of doing. We put a man on the moon, with some help from Werner von Braun, but still. America has had the best scientific and technology education in the world. We can aspire to that again, and we can get there again. And the Franklin Standards is meant to be the first and the necessary step. And if we make this case above all to the states, because the state governments are still the crucial players in the education of American children, then by making an education revolution in science in the states and the school districts and the classrooms and in every home in America where a parent cares about what their child is learning, we can restore science education and make it better than it's ever been.
I would like to add two things.
Mm-hmm.
So our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, says one of the roles of government is to promote science. And if any of those politicians, school board members, legislators were to go to a local university and see the postdocs there in any of the science fields and ask them, where did you get your K through 12 education? They'd find out a minority of the postdocs got their K through 12 science education in the United States.
One of the things about the Franklin Standards is that about Benjamin Franklin in particular, is that he approached knowledge from a very democratic and uniquely American approach to it. He came from, he was very heavily influenced by people like James Watt in the UK, and framed in the whole Industrial Revolution and the kind of egalitarian, really, motivations behind that. And one of the concerns today is that there are certain ethnic groups, minority groups, what have you, that are not being well served by science education today. And what do the Franklin Science Standards do to correct that? I mean, they would be difficult, challenging. Isn't that a way to challenge all students to become well-educated future scientists?
Yes, and I must say, and against, unfortunately, the majority of education school theory, and therefore, alas, the majority of education department practice in America. But what common sense and a good number of education researchers who really study this in detail will tell you is that content-rich resources are absolutely necessary to fulfill the democratic promise of America. And that's because when you cut content in the name of equity, you hurt disadvantaged students the most, because they don't have the resources at home to make up for what's been cut, whereas advantaged students have, science books at home, parents who have themselves taken science courses, every bit of private encouragement that will make up for what the public schools, the schools, don't provide. So when you cut science content in the name of equity, what you're actually doing is making for a more unequal society where those that have relatively greater knowledge, those that have not are never given the chance to learn. And so if you really want to make an equal and equitable society, what you absolutely need is content-rich instruction, and for us, above all, in science, in the schools, to make sure that there is, as they say, a level playing field for college, for career, for the chance to learn and love science.
I'll add one thing to that. With the Ithaca school budget was just voted down because for a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons were people realized that the high amount of equity meant that there wasn't enough content, and the parents, the haves, could hire tutors for their kids or teach they can teach their kids in the friends group. But the have-nots weren't able to afford tutors. So the whole introducing equity in school and squeezing out content actually caused a greater division between the haves and have-nots. And the budget in a place like Ithaca was voted down, I think, for the first time.
And of course, Heather McDonald has pointed out several times that the skills gap of students coming into university, for example, is driven by an equity agenda, and it does nothing but disadvantage the very people that it's intended to help. It's the classic example of roads to hell being paved with good intentions.
Speaking of the road to hell is paved with good intentions, I brought in this book. The type was set by Benjamin Franklin himself. It's The Religion of Nature, delineated by William Wollaston. And William Wollaston concludes that the pursuit of happiness by the practice of reason and truth is the truest definition. And the Franklin standards let people know that there's a truth, teach people how to pursue that truth, and that will bring happiness to anyone.